So now we're going to move on to David Vine, writer and political anthropologist, author of the books The United States of War, Base Nation, and Island of Shame. David will focus on the dominant role of the military industrial complex in U.S. foreign policy and the urgency of developing innovative strategies to confront war profiteers and dismantle the economic and political underpinnings of the war system. David Vine, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and really thank you for everyone in the audience, everyone watching later. This is a time of great anxiety from fires in LA to the incoming Trump administration to genocide in Gaza and far beyond. There are many things you could be doing right now. We really appreciate the chance to engage, and hopefully I'll offer something that is of some help. I do also want to thank the entire Teach-In Network and Roots to Action for putting together tonight's event and the entire series. Want to thank Eric Ross in particular for his role, Bill Lacamacher, and David Swanson, of course, and others, surely behind the scenes. I want to essentially now recruit you to get involved. One of the reasons I think the Teach-In Network, the focus on foreign policy is so important is because for so long, U.S. foreign policy has been dominated by corporate interests, by capitalist interests, by the war profiteers, by the military industrial complex, and by people who look a lot like me, typically, privileged white dudes who tend to shill for the war profiteers. We desperately need, in this particularly undemocratic realm of policy, we desperately need new people involved, new voices, new perspectives to transform the status quo. I'm here thus to recruit you to get involved in organizations like Roots Action and in movements to free ourselves from this incredibly violent, deadly status quo and from the war profiteers that have effectively hijacked U.S. foreign policy for far, far, far too long. With that, I want to share a bit of what I heard, and this builds off something that David was talking about and Ryan were talking about at the beginning. I was in Arizona leading up to the election and talking to potential voters, and I heard again and again words like, "We're sick of endless US wars. We don't want World War III. We're sick of war." These were words coming from Trump voters, from independents who were likely not going to vote at all, and from a few leftists. But it was notable that these sorts of comments were coming from people across the political spectrum. And for this reason and others, I want to, above all, emphasize tonight that I think we desperately need and can build a populist anti-war movement, an explicitly, unapologetically populist anti-war movement. And I think it's one that can, given the things David was saying before, the things I heard in Arizona, and for many other reasons, I think this is one that can attract people across the political spectrum and ultimately across the globe. I want to share a few thoughts about what I think a populist foreign policy could look like, but that's particularly what I would love to hear your thoughts about, and more broadly, how we are going to transform US foreign policy. As David Swanson laid out earlier, in short, US foreign policy has really since independence, but especially since World War II, been defined by a long series of catastrophic wars, as well as coups and other forms of military, political, economic meddling in other countries' affairs. A long series of catastrophic wars and other forms of military, political, economic meddling that have caused immense death and destruction. It's really, there aren't words or numbers that can capture the death and destruction that our foreign policy has caused. So, what could a populist anti war movement, a populist foreign policy look like? I want to share a few quick thoughts. I think, first and foremost, it could be a foreign policy that would demand a peace dividend. It's a foreign policy that could end war profiteering, focus on ending war profiteering and the corrupt military industrial complex or corrupt military industrial congressional complex that has kept us in the long series of catastrophic, deadly wars. It's a foreign policy that could be focused on building treaties, on reducing weapons production and the weapons that countries possess, as Emma was referring to. It's a foreign policy that could focus on disaster and public health response. It's a foreign policy that could put the lives and well-being of people first, rather than a real politique. It could be a foreign policy focused on a human politique. It's a foreign policy that could underline the what should be common sense that war should not be considered a legitimate policy option for the United States or any country. It's a foreign policy that could focus on renouncing war and the use of military force except to defend the borders of a nation. This may sound fantastical, naive to many. It surely does, especially given the entrenched power of the military industrial complex that has kept the United States trapped in a long series of catastrophic, deadly wars. But I think this is a time where we can't afford a kind of self-fulfilling pessimism that would constrain our thinking. And instead, I think it's a time where we have to think as boldly and broadly as possible, to unite together with other people to build a foreign policy that works for people around the globe, a globalist, even foreign policy, perhaps to reclaim that word globalist, a globalist, populist foreign policy that could build on the sentiments we hear when people say we're sick of endless wars and we don't want World War III, and instead focus on building the world of peace, equity, and justice that I know the vast majority of us want to see. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. Very much appreciate you being here. We do have several questions for you. And thank you to the attendees for really engaging with us. You guys can see the everyone chat, but there's the Q&A chat that we can see, and then there's just the host and panel, and there's a lot of chat going on, and that's awesome. So thank you so much, everybody. David, first question. I want to ask you about the peace dividend first. You had mentioned that. I'm 34, so I wasn't around for when that was like maybe almost a real thing from what I've read about. How close was that to being real? And were people aware of it and looking forward to it and like then disappointed or what happened?
In some ways, it was a real thing. It wasn't necessarily a real thing that people got in the mail the way there were, stimulus checks in the wake of the or amid the COVID pandemic. But the U.S. Pentagon budget, the military budget, the war budget was cut dramatically after the end of the Cold War. And this also saw a decrease in the number of U.S. military bases abroad and at home. So it is something that can happen. And when we look at, there have been few moments when movements that have sought to cut the war budget, the Pentagon budget, there have been few moments when those sorts of movements have been successful. But after the end of the Cold War, that was one moment. And I think the language of the peace dividend is one that I think could resonate with many people. Some would resonate more with the peace part, some more with the dividend part. But I think it could be an element of a populist foreign policy and populist anti-war movement that I'm alluding to or encouraging us to consider.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a totally different angle here. Can the anti-war movement succeed without confronting capitalism and imperialism, those big things?
Yes, it's a challenging question, of course. Of course, I don't have the answer. I do think, and this was sort of underlying a lot of what I was sharing. I've been working together with people in what we've called the network to dismantle the military-industrial complex. I think we need to take on the economic and political foundations of the war system, period. We can envision foreign policy all we like, and that's important, envisioning the world we want to see, the kind of foreign policy we want to see. But we have to grapple with and take on the economic and political foundations of the war system that have kept us trapped in this long series of endless wars. And that means taking on the military industrial complex, which is the heart of that economic political foundation. I think taking on capitalism writ large would be yet, I mean, some laugh at, the goal of dismantling the military industrial complex. Taking on capitalism writ large is yet another level of difficulty. So I think the focusing on the military industrial complex, that, it's one that formed and grew over time from the days of Eisenhower to today and has grown in power and destructive power. But because it grew through a process, a series of changes, it is a process that can be reversed. It is not inevitable. It is not forever. And it's one I believe we can take on and undermine and ultimately dismantle.
Excellent. I have one more question. I'm holding you a little longer, running a couple minutes late. Um, I want to ask you about bases because you've wrote so much about bases. Um, I hope you can answer this question. Might be weird. What happens first, or is it if we get rid of bases, will we do less war, or do we need to start by doing less war and then we'll get rid of bases?
Both could happen, of course. But I think as David Swanson explained toward the beginning, a large collection of foreign military bases, and this is part of what I explain in my book, The United States of War, indeed make war more likely, make war an all too easy policy option for powerful people, politicians, elites of various kinds. And closing US military bases abroad is a good idea for many reasons and would actually increase the security of the United States and the world. But making it harder to wage war overseas is certainly one of the reasons why it's a good and important idea. But you could, of course, imagine a world in which the United States would cease waging war. But I think closing bases abroad is an important part of a broad anti-war movement and strategy.